What's up, everybody? It's Dakota, and today I'm going to be going over probably the best deck to beat Mono Red and the various types of Nissa slash control decks that are being played in the format right now, and that's Temur Reclamation. A deck that's kind of been around for a long time, probably since Wilderness Reclamation has been a card in Standard, and people thought it was going to get banned, and obviously hasn't, and then didn't really make any noise. Really, after Simic Nexus came and went in the format. So essentially, what this deck is trying to do, and kind of what it's always tried to do, is play either a bunch of Wilderness Reclamations and a bunch of lands and cast a really huge explosion to kill your opponent, and then also with style make them draw their entire deck so that they die two different ways instead of just one. But some new innovations, if you want to call them, to the deck has really just added more interaction and like modal type spells. So we look at the first one, like Brazen Borrower. Uh, Nothing really new as far as like being new to standard. Like this card is just awesome. Uh, Returns a non-land permanent opponent controls to its owner's hand, and then you also have a 3/1 flyer that can only block creatures with flying, but like really doesn't matter because you're just gonna kind of get in the red zone with this thing anyway. Uro from Theros Beyond Death. Attacks or enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life, draw a card, put a land from your hand into play. Really good when you're a deck that's playing 26 lands. You're like almost always going to be able to put a land into play and ramp with Uro. And then eventually, just by casting all these spells and even discarding cards like to Thirst for Meaning and things like that, you're going to be able to bring it back and get a 6/6 for 4 mana that's also going to then gain you another 3 life, draw you a card, and then more than likely put another land into play. And then your opponent has to deal with this card on top of worrying about dying to explosion as well. And you kind of see where I'm getting at with this is like this deck has kind of just evolved into playing some more threats, but the threats are very valuey and just kind of help you dig towards your ultimate goal of just playing a giant explosion and killing your opponent. So, aside from that, like we went over the creatures, we went over like basically the namesake enchantment and the namesake card. How the heck are we getting there? Growth Spiral is pretty key in getting down an early Wilderness Reclamation and getting underneath counter spells and things like that, because it takes you from like 2 mana when you pass the turn, hopefully putting a land into play as your third one, and then when you untap on your turn 3, playing your fourth land, and then just playing a Wilderness Reclamation, and then being able to untap as well. Um, this is pretty good at like almost any stage of the game, just for the fact that like most of the time it's going to be putting a land into play, and then it's going to draw you a card. It will become something else, and then it feels the your Uros for later in the game too as well. So all around, just really powerful when it puts your Wilderness Reclamation into play a turn earlier, or some of your other stuff just kind of gets like 1 point bigger in terms of like Krasis or fueling the Uro and things like that. Thassa's Intervention is another modal spell for the deck. You pay double blue and X, and you can either look at the top X cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand, the rest on the bottom, or up to 2 of them into your hand, the rest on the bottom in a random order, or counter a spell unless its controller pays twice of X. This is one where you could just put 5-6 mana into it and then take 2 of the best 6 cards that you have. It's basically like a dig through time that you have to actually pay mana for, but like you don't have to pay 8 to cast it. You can just pay 2 blue and 2 and then draw 2 cards if you so choose to draw 2 cards. Um, and it's even a little bit better because it gets around Narset, so you're not technically drawing the cards either. You're just putting the cards into your hand, or just being a counterspell where you can counterspell unless your opponent pays 2, unless his controller pays essentially 2. Effectively being like a weaker cancel, but most of the time still getting the job done. Mystical Dispute is just 1 mana interaction for the control decks, things like that. Even 3 mana leak is alright some of the time, especially when you're playing cards like Wilderness Reclamation. You're tapping out on your turn to do things and then untapping with Wilderness Reclamation. So you can leave up your Mystical Disputes, Thoughts' Interventions, and your Thirst for Meanings, which obviously this lets you just draw 3 cards, discard 2 cards unless you discard an enchantment card. can fuel Uro very nicely. I mean, just playing this and then discarding 2 cards puts 3 cards in the graveyard. If you Growth Spiral the turn before, like you're just 1 card away from playing Uro. Or if you have another Uro in there, you just play another Uro. Um, Storm's Wrath really good against like the small creature decks, like especially mono red. Just really powerful, dealing 4 damage to everything or to each creature in each planeswalker is really good and will continue to be really good for as long as people like to play creatures in standard. Expansion Explosion we already went over. Expansion does copy a 4 or less cost spell, so you could copy some of your own spells like a Thirst for Meaning or Mystical Dispute if you need to. It can also copy like an opponent's Thought Erasure or things like that, which can also be really good from time to time. Wilderness Reclamation, kind of what the deck is like named after. At the beginning of your end step, you untap all lands you control. Really good when you can tap out for spells and things like that to then just play Wilderness Reclamation and then untap and things like that. Omen of the Sea, uh, basically instant speed, 2 mana preordain that also gives you a little bit more value by getting to sack it to scry 2. Which is really important when we're just trying to dig past some of our lands once we hit a critical mass of lands to either find more Wilderness Reclamations or just find Expansion Explosion. Speaking of the lands and the mana base, you have like a few utility lands that you're playing in this deck, and by a few I mean like 2, and then some tap lands that give you a little bit of utility. So like Blast Zone and Castle Vantress are your 2 uh, main utility lands. Like Blast Zone comes into play with a charge counter on it. You can pay mana to put charge counters on it, and then you can pay 3 sacrifice to destroy each non-land permanent with a converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. Deals with problematic permanents on your opponent's side of the board. Also, with Wilderness Reclamation, you can add counters to it and then untap it and then be able to activate it. Castle Vantress scries 2. Again, when we play like a ton of lands, 26 to be exact, you definitely want to avoid flooding out, and Castle Vantress can scry you past your lands and help you dig for spells. Fable Passage finds some of the odd basics that are in our deck. Obviously, red isn't super important a lot of the time, so that's why there's one mountain and you're playing more forests and islands. But nonetheless, this can go pick them up on top of the millions of dual lands that we play. Like, this is just added color fixing that's free that also feels the Uro as well. Um, Temple of Abandon, Temple of Epiphany, and Temple of Mystery are the Scrylands of choice, essentially. Like, obviously, there's like a lot of blue, so playing 4 blue temples instead of playing like 3 or playing 4 green temples makes a lot of sense when you have a decent amount of like double blue and spells that you definitely want blue mana for. Also, scrying again, just going past lands, or if you need to look for lands, like they help you find lands, things like that. Sideboard, Aether Gust, really good against like mono red. Any really good against like the Nissa decks and things like that. Almost unnecessary to basically stave off dying and to really just slow down their clock. Negate because we can't play Dovin's Veto. Scorching Dragonfire is in here. I'm assuming really you can just tag Uros. Um, Basically with the trigger on the stack to sacrifice it if it didn't escape. You can Scorching Dragonfire it. While the Scorching Dragonfire doesn't kill it, when it gets sacrificed by its own ability, since it was dealt the 3 damage from the Scorching Dragonfire, it actually gets exiled, which is really important considering that your opponent doesn't get an arrow in their graveyard anymore, which is sweet. Mystical Dispute is more interaction. Nightpack Ambusher and Niv-Mizzet Perun are really, I feel like, for the control matchups a lot of the time, like Niv-Mizzet doesn't get countered, and then it just gets to draw a ton of draw a ton of cards from your opponent if they try to remove it, or if they're trying to dig and they can't remove it, then your opponent's just gonna have a bad time because you're just gonna draw more cards, and then eventually just find more ways to kill your opponent. Um, Also, really good when paired with Wilderness Reclamation as well, obviously, because you get to play this and then untap, and then you have like your Mystical Disputes and Thassa's Interventions and things like that to protect it from other removal spells, and then also draw more cards because you're casting those spells. Because Niv doesn't care who cast those instant or sorcery spells; it just cares that they were cast. Nightpack Ambusher also just lets you play on your opponent's turn. We play a lot of instants in the deck, so the fact that you can just play Nightpack Ambusher, untap, if you have wilderness reclamation to play, and even when you don't have a wilderness reclamation, Nightpack Ambusher is still really good because then you just make a 2/2 that ends up being a 3/3 because the Nightpack Ambusher is also a lord. Just kind of snowballs out of control, makes your opponent have to deal with this, and then again has to do it through the amount of interaction that you've brought in to your deck as well. So that's it for Temur Reclamation. Again, this deck is kind of built to fight and hedge against the blue-white control decks and the mono-red decks, which are probably far and away the most popular decks played in the format right now. This deck is really sweet. I recommend picking it up and playing it if you run into a lot of either of those decks, and you don't want to play either one of those decks, essentially. That's going to do it for me in this video, though. I appreciate you guys watching the video. Check out the playlist for more standard decks coming in the future, as well as more modern and pioneer decks to come. Consider subscribing to the channel because I do at least one modern, pioneer, and standard deck tech every week. Do some discussion type videos. Heck, I even did a discussion video on talking about data that Wizards for some reason won't let Frank Karsten give us because they think it helps their formats. Even though people are just smart, we play a ton of Magic anyway. But that's neither here nor there. Check out that video if that's something that would interest you. And yeah, definitely consider subscribing to the channel. I post at least 3 videos a week. Trying to do like 4 or 5, but sometimes things get really hard. But yeah, that's going to do it for me. I appreciate you guys watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.